All right, so picking where we last left off, we are on our second to last chapter here, the sectional crisis. This is chapter 13. This is going to bring us right up to the start of the Civil War. It picks up with that question that I left you on the last chapter, which is what do we do about these new lands acquired as a result of the Mexican War? Are they going to be free states or slave states once these territories apply to become states? And this is going to be the main issue that will. So, again, to review, slavery's expansion west created huge problems for the United States. The North felt that slavery suppressed wages and stole land from poor whites, whereas the South felt that abolitionists would dominate politics without slavery's expansion. They also feared an increasingly dense enslaved population would lead to riots. This is a huge fear that many Southern plantation owners have, because if you have a large plantation, which again is a small population, small part of the South's population, but nevertheless the part of the population that dominates political life there, you have to fear that what's going to stop your slaves from rising up and committing violence against you. And what they need is a pro-slavery government to maintain order and to help prevent that from happening. And they fear that the North, as it becomes more populous, is going to come to dominate the government, and the government is not going to support their way of life. As the North gradually abolished slavery, a lot of enslaved men and women started to escape north on what would become the Underground Railroad, which is a series of hideaways and safe houses that slaves and their guides would use on their way north. Also, the North and the South disagreed on the role of the federal government in capturing and returning these runaway slaves, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. The North appealed to the states' rights to refuse to capture an escaped slave, whereas the South demanded a national commitment to slavery. So what the North is saying there is that we don't have slavery, a northern state, we don't have slavery in our borders. So someone who comes here has the right to live here. We don't want to capture them and send them back to slavery, whereas the South is saying there needs to be a national commitment to slavery, else all slaves are going to try to escape to the North. Do remember that despite the North kind of coming off as being better than the South, at least morally here, enslaved laborers remained vitally important to the nation's economy, North and South. They may have fueled the South's plantation economy, but remember they're also providing a lot of raw materials for the industrial North, mainly cotton. And so as you can see, the differences over the fate of slavery is at the heart of American politics at this time. It is the issue. Both the North and the South felt and feared that the opposite section of the country was going to be able to seize control of the government. And generally speaking, trying to keep that balance between free state and slave state has been the order of the day. And we're going to see here that that's going to start to be clearly not the answer anymore. It's not going to be something that's going to work long term. It's been a temporary fix up until this point. Also, by November of 1860, a very strong candidate who was an opponent of slavery arose from within the Republican Party in Abraham Lincoln. And a crisis nearly a century in the making is going to end up in the bloody Civil War. All right, so each of these things that we're going to talk about is all about slavery, the expansion of slavery in the West. Again, this is the heart of everything. So we'll start with the Wilmot Proviso. In August of 1846, David Wilmot, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania, attached a rider to an appropriations bill. So a rider is like an amendment to a bill, like an add-on to a bill. So if a lawmaker has something controversial that they think a lot of people aren't going to support, they'll try to attach it as a rider to a more popular or like mainstream bill, like an appropriations bill, to try to like sneakily get it through Congress. So this bill was controversial at the time. It barred slavery from any territory that we had acquired as a result of the Mexican War. Not surprisingly, it's supported in the North but opposed in the South. It was able to pass the House 2 times. Remember, the House is dominated by the North because the North is more populous. The states, there may be an equal number of states, but membership in the House is determined by population, and the states in the North are more populous than the South. So they dominate the House. So it passed twice in the House, but unsurprisingly, it was defeated in the South. So, since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, both parties have tried to suppress questions of slavery in the West. Again, just kind of kicking the can down the road. Like, well, maybe if we just keep it equal, add a free state, add a slave state, then that's going to solve the issue. Clearly, it has not. Wilmot defended his proviso because he felt that it ensured the rights of white free men to live and work in the West, and so they wouldn't have to compete with slave labor if there was no slave labor. So this eventually is going to form the Free Soil Party. I'll get to that here. It's a rallying point for the anti-slavery coalition, which formed the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party pledged support for free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. So they're not necessarily an abolitionist party, because they don't want to get rid of slavery where it is, and they don't want to get rid of slavery. They don't want to stop slavery from expanding in the West because of moral questions. It's more of, well, slavery actually harms poor whites who can't afford, or even middle-class whites who can't afford slaves. Before, when we talked about this in our other chapter on slavery, we talked about how it's economically bad for people who can't afford slaves, because you can't compete with slave labor. Slave labor is free. So if you're a small-time carpenter, you can't compete with somebody who's going to do the work for free. And so that's where their argument is. It's not necessarily like the abolitionists who are attacking it as being morally wrong. So Southern leaders saw the proviso as the beginning of a long postponed attack on slavery. They were determined to defend slavery, and they denounced any attempt to restrict the expansion of slavery. Because remember, if slavery is outlawed in the West, it's outlawed in the territories, that's going to flip the country very much in favor of free states. It's already more populous in the South, so they see this all as a conspiracy to get rid of their way of life in the South. And remember that though very few people in the South were actually able to own slaves in any large number, those are the people who are dominating politics. Those are the powerful people. Those are the voices who are being heard. So the Wilmot Proviso became something that really reawakened sectional tensions over the expansion of slavery. And it sets off the beginning of a long series of just these bitter crises that we'll talk about that dominate politics until the Civil War of 1861. And each one just gets more and more tense. Supporters of the proviso argue that slavery degraded free labor. And again, the argument is that free soil would guarantee liberty for whites. So it's not necessarily an abolitionist approach. It's more of a slavery is bad because it hurts poor whites idea. So, second major issue resolving about slavery is the Compromise of 1850. So, the extension of slavery also started one of the most dramatic and intense Senate debates. So, the problem is California asked to be a state. It was a territory, won as a result of the Mexican War, now wants to be a state. At the time, there were 30 states, 15 free, 15 slave. Again, this problem keeps coming up, and they just keep thinking, we just need to compromise. So California is going to break the tie. And again, the question is, what about the other territories we won in the Mexican War? What about when they start requesting to become states? What do we do? And so the Senate decides, you know what, we're going to try to resolve this issue of slavery. Spoiler alert, they don't. 3 different leaders are going to propose 3 different solutions. John C. Calhoun, who, as you will recall, the picture up there on the upper right-hand corner, one of the most terrifying men of history, is going to advocate that there be 2 presidents. 1 president for free states and 1 president for slave states. I mean, generally here, his idea is we're already starting to divide the nation. William H. Seward, the guy in the middle there, who is going to become Lincoln's Secretary of State and who also had an assassination attempt on his life at the same time in which Lincoln was assassinated. It was all part of a greater plot. Believed that slavery should be abolished. He was a staunch abolitionist. And Henry Clay, once again, proposes a compromise, this time the Compromise of 1850. This guy's all about compromises. The compromise was that they would admit California as a free state, but then they would determine that all other territories would decide by vote whether they be free or slave. And this is a concept known as popular sovereignty, which we're going to talk more about. And to appease the Southerners, in exchange for admitting California as a free state, they were going to adopt a very strict Fugitive Slave Act, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who we're going to talk more about as well, is already planning his bid to become president. And so he wants to do some pretty big, important things to get him noticed here. He helps maneuver the compromise through the Senate, and it is passed. Once again, lots of people think, all right, this is the issue, as they did with the Missouri Compromise. We fixed it. No more issues with slavery. But of course, we know this was only a temporary fix, though it did give the North time to grow, time to build more factories, build more railroads. These are things that are going to be essential in helping the North win the war. All right, so what did the Fugitive Slave Act declare? Well, that anyone, anywhere, could track down escaped slaves and send them back to their owners, even if they made it to the North. And despite, you would think that this would discourage people from using the Underground Railroad, but it really only encourages more enslaved people to use the Underground Railroad and to seek freedom. So what is the Underground Railroad? Well, it is an unorganized network of safe houses and shelters through which runaways passed on their way to freedom. It's not like an organized trail or even an actual railroad. Every year that I teach this, there are some people who are shocked that the Underground Railroad is not an actual railroad. It is a series of safe houses and shelters. So throughout the South, there were people who also opposed slavery. They were in the minority, but they were there. And they would house a slave and tell them where to go, where the next safe house was. This was repeated until they were firmly out of the reach of slave hunters, many going to the north, some going all the way to Canada. A big part of the Underground Railroad were the Quakers, or the Society of Friends. We've talked about them before. They were the religious group that believed everyone was equal. They were also pacifists and didn't believe in war, and they did quite a bit of work on the Underground Railroad. And you can see the generalized routes of slaves go. Again, it's not like a really organized network, but generally speaking, these are the routes that slaves would go. You can see they really went all the way around much of Illinois. Lots of people think their houses were part of the Underground Railroad. Number one, your house would have to be very old, pre-1861, pre-Civil War, so that's pretty old. And number two, you can clearly see that a lot of people avoided Illinois, and that's because of the Southern Illinois' proximity to southern states and also to Missouri, which was a slave state. It made a lot of people sympathetic to slavery. A lot of people had actually moved from slave states into southern and central Illinois, and so generally speaking, they tried to go around most of the state. The Underground Railroad was very dangerous to use or help. If you were an escaped slave, punishment would be severe. And if you were housing escaped slaves, you could be attacked yourself. And you could be fined as well. However, despite that, many returned to help others escape, the most famous of which being, of course, Harriet Tubman. And this is an early example of civil disobedience. We talked about that when we talked about Thoreau's civil disobedience. You're breaking an unjust law, but you're not hurting anybody in order to prove your point. So while the Compromise of 1850 temporarily settles the issue over slavery in the territories, the Fugitive Slave Act really makes a lot of people very angry, and it keeps the issue of slavery alive. It appalled many people, one of which was Harriet Beecher Stowe, a dedicated abolitionist from Connecticut, who wrote the very famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's an abolitionist, but she's not a slave owner. But what she tried to do was to help readers understand the cruelty of the slave system by vividly describing the fear and panic endured by slaves. Because again, we talked about this before when we talked about Frederick Douglass writing his accounts. If you're living in the North, you might know on a moral level that slavery might be wrong, but you don't really know the particulars of it. Again, you have to put yourself in the time period in which we're talking about. There's no TVs, there's no radio, there's no real good way for you to get a sense of what it's really like. And so that's what this book did for people. It opened people's eyes to the real cruelty of the system. It was first published in 1852. It sold over 300,000 copies within its first year and shortly became an international sensation and eventually sold over 2.3 million copies worldwide. And became hugely significant in again, awakening many people in the North to the horrors of slavery and adding fuel to this fire of slavery, this question of what do we do about it. All right, so stepping into the fray and trying to offer his own view on what we should do about slavery while also advancing his own political career at the same time is this guy, Stephen Douglas. In January of 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois once again reopened the issue of slavery in the territories. He proposed a bill to organize two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas and Nebraska were a part of the Louisiana Territory, which we know was purchased by Jefferson way back at the turn of the 19th century. And the Missouri Compromise had effectively banned slavery in the Louisiana Territory. However, Stephen Douglas wanted to win some Southern support for himself because he wanted to make a bid for president. And so he proposed an amendment which would specifically repeal the Missouri Compromise in his Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas's bill proposed that the people of Kansas and Nebraska should decide whether they be free or slave by vote. And this is very important. Letting settlers of a territory have the sole right to decide whether or not slavery would be permitted within their borders is a concept known as popular sovereignty. And Stephen Douglas and many others, but especially Stephen Douglas, staked his political future on this idea. In his mind, this is the way we deal with the issue of slavery. This is the answer. And Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this did not solve the issue of slavery. It only sharpened the divide between the North and the South. So Kansas and Nebraska, if they're going to decide by popular sovereignty whether they be free or slave, the group that gets the most settlers there are going to be the group that determines the fate of the state. So literally you had people from the North, like wealthy abolitionists, paying people to go settle in Kansas or Nebraska, and the same with people in the South. They were like basically encouraging people to go settle there so that they could flip the state whichever way they wanted. Unsurprisingly, violence is going to break out in Kansas, earning it the nickname Bleeding Kansas. In May of 1856, the pro-slavery sheriff of one town led a mob into the anti-slavery town of Lawrence and burned it. And in retaliation, a man by the name of John Brown, who we'll learn more about later on, is going to lead a party of to a pro-slavery settlement of Pottawatomie Creek and murder 5 men. So obviously, popular sovereignty. Things get so bad that violence even reaches Congress, people. We tend to think, oh, we're so divided today. We've never been this divided before. We have. I'm not saying it's a good thing that we're this divided now, because it's not, but this is not the only time things have been bad. We even had a beating in Congress, if you can imagine it. So what happened was a senator by the name of Charles Sumner made this speech in which he had personally attacked several Southerners. Not surprisingly, it was a speech over slavery. A congressman by the name of Preston S. Brooks was the nephew of a senator who had been insulted. And in the grand Southern tradition of preserving his honor, he felt that he had to do something about it. And so he literally attacked in Congress Sumner with a cane on May 22nd, 1856. So bad that Sumner never regained his health. Like, this isn't just like he slapped him kind of a thing. I mean, he really beat him. Brooks resigned as a result of the attack, but he was later reelected and became a Southern hero. And again, Sumner never regained his health. So this gives you an idea of just how bad things are getting over this issue of slavery. And yet people are still dedicated to this idea of we can still find a compromise. Clearly that's not going to work, but people still think somehow it's going to work. We just need to find the right compromise. So the Democrats and the Whigs have been the two main political parties of the 1830s and 1850s. But the anger over the Kansas-Nebraska Act really dealt the Whigs their final blow and led to the formation of the Republican Party. And the Whig Party generally is going to disintegrate under pressure of violence in Kansas, and the Republican Party is going to emerge as the more powerful party, and the Whigs fade out. So we're going to get the Democrats and Republicans after this, though again, not the same Democrats and Republicans of today. The Republicans are going to be the anti-slavery party who oppose all expansion of slavery in the West. They hold their first national convention in 1856, in which they nominate John C. Fremont. The Democrats, on the other hand, are going to nominate James Buchanan, who is going to win. And this is going to become a sectional contest. Buchanan wins, but Fremont carries 11 of the free states. And this underscores this really ominous sectionalization of politics is really becoming a North and South issue here. And we are increasingly becoming a divided nation. Adding to this is going to be a very controversial Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. So Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom. He had been taken by his master to Illinois and Minnesota, both of which outlawed slavery. And so his argument was, I lived in a free state. I am a... Well, what did the Supreme Court decide? Well, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, they decided that Scott was not free because the Constitution was written for white men only. And because of that, blacks could not sue. They could not cite their rights within the Constitution. They had no rights to sue. They went further. They said that the Missouri Compromise, the Northwest Ordinance, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all unconstitutional because, A, a slave was the property of his owner, and Congress does not have the right to deprive someone of their property in the territories because territories were the property of all Americans. Whew. That's a lot. So the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision is huge. It effectively repeals the Missouri Compromise and establishes the principle that Congress cannot limit the spread of slavery in the territories. That's hugely important. That's saying that the territories are open to slavery. You can say we're going to be a free state once you become a state, but if it's a territory, it's open to slavery. So that's pretty bad. And a Supreme Court decision can only be overturned by an amendment or another Supreme Court decision overturning that decision. So this invalidated the Republican platform of opposing the extension of slavery because it's basically saying Congress can't do that. So initially, it's a setback for the Republicans, but it does cause Republicans to redouble their efforts to win the presidency because their victory would enable them to change the Southern-dominated Supreme Court because, of course, the president has the power to nominate a Supreme Court justice. And if they're able to do that, then they're able to reverse the Dred Scott decision. And this idea is going to play a key role in a series of debates between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, which we're going to talk about now. So a Senate seat was up for election in Illinois, and both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln wanted it. Stephen Douglas is defending his seat, and Abraham Lincoln is challenging it. And they challenge each other to a series of debates throughout Illinois, the most famous of which happens in Freeport, Illinois, in which Lincoln skillfully backs Douglas into a corner by asking him whether or not the people of a territory could lawfully exclude slavery before they had become a state. Now, this is tricky for Douglas because if he says yes, he goes against the Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court. But if he says no, he goes against the idea of popular sovereignty, which again is his answer to the slavery issue. It's what he's staked his political future on. So Douglas states, well, territories cannot outlaw the practice of slavery, but they can pass laws unfriendly to the practice, which would help prevent slavery from taking hold. And this is known as the Freeport Doctrine, and it really alienates his Southern supporters and prevents him from getting the presidential election. So Douglas does end up winning the Senate seat, but he lost ground within his own party by alienating Southern Democrats. He is a Democrat. And as a result, Lincoln emerges as the leading contender for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. So things continue to escalate. The violence continues to escalate with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So the idea that John Brown was a militant abolitionist. He believed in using violence to stop slavery. He wanted to fight against slavery by arming slaves, and he intended to do that. On October of 1859, he attacked a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. The U.S. Marines pretty quickly put down this attack. They were led by Robert E. Lee. And the South really saw this as this kind of conspiracy that the North were going to use the slaves to kill white Southerners. And again, that's a big fear that they had, that their slaves were somehow going to rise up against them, and that the North was going to encourage them to do it. Now, this was not part of a Northern conspiracy. This was John Brown acting of his own volition, but it really is going to be not the last straw, but I guess you could say the second to last straw for the South. All right, so the election of 1860, the Democrats really shook themselves in the foot here, and that they split the ticket. They have two nominees, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. So since they have two nominees, they split their own ticket. The Republicans, with Abraham Lincoln, are going to win. Lincoln wins despite only winning 39% of the popular vote. He carried no electoral votes from 10 southern states, but he did win electoral votes from 18 free slaves, thus winning the election. The South sees this as the sign, this election of a Republican who has come out as being very personally and strongly against slavery, as a sign that slavery is under attack, coupled with all the other things that have happened up until this. South Carolina cedes first. If you recall back to the nullification crisis, South Carolina almost ceded under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Now they are first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. They get together and write a new constitution and declare that a new nation, the Confederate States of America, is formed. So that doesn't necessarily mean war has broken out, though. The South claims that they are their own nation, whereas the rest of the country says, no, you're not, and there's no fighting going on yet. So what starts the fighting? Well, the Confederates cut off supplies to Fort Sumter, claiming that we are now our own nation. You cannot have a fort on our soil. You have to get rid of it, and we're going to cut off supplies to it and basically starve them into submission. Lincoln knows that if he sends supplies, that means there's going to be a civil war. But if he doesn't send supplies, that means the South will be able to have their own way, and that's going to be basically him letting the Union go. It's going to be the end of the nation. So Lincoln decides that he's going to let the South fire the first shot, basically. He's going to notify South Carolina that he is sending supplies to Fort Sumter and let them decide